The moment you save a stranger's life, you might accidentally ruin your own. That was the first thought that crossed my mind when I opened my front door that morning. The quiet little street in Queens where I'd lived for 3 years was never busy before 8 a.m., but now the entire block looked like something out of a movie I never asked to be in. Black SUVs stretched down both sides of the street, engines humming low, windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. Men in dark suits stood along the sidewalk, calm and still, like they'd been waiting there all night. I counted at least 20 vehicles before my brain stopped trying. My neighbor Mrs. Delgado peeked through her curtains across the street, her eyes wide. No police lights, no reporters, just silence and 200 men who clearly weren't here for coffee. One of them stepped forward when he saw me in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe mid-40s, the kind of man who looked like he didn't waste words. His voice was calm when he spoke. "Miss Claire Bennett." Hearing my name made my stomach tighten. "Yes," I managed. He gave a small, respectful nod, like I was someone important even though I knew I wasn't. "Mr. Cross is here because of what you did last night." For a second my mind went blank. Last night. Rain. The smell of antiseptic. Blood on the tile floor of my tiny pharmacy after closing. My hand stitching a wound I never should have touched. I swallowed hard and looked past him toward the line of SUVs. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man didn't argue. He simply turned his head slightly, and that's when the door of the SUV parked directly in front of my house opened. Everything else on the street seemed to fade for a second. The man who stepped out looked nothing like the one I had helped 12 hours earlier. Last night he had been pale, exhausted, leaning against the counter in my pharmacy while rain hammered against the windows and the neon open sign flickered above us. His shirt had been torn and his breathing uneven, but his eyes had stayed sharp the entire time, watching every movement I made. Now he looked like someone carved out of calm authority. Dark suit, crisp white shirt, no sign of weakness at all. Damian Cross. I didn't know his name yet, but the way every man on the street straightened when he stepped forward told me enough. He moved with quiet confidence, like the ground itself belonged to him. My heart started pounding harder with every step he took toward my porch. The memory of last night flashed through my mind whether I wanted it to or not. The back door of the pharmacy rattling in the wind. The sudden thud in the alley behind the building. I had grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside expecting to find a knocked-over trash can. Instead, I found a stranger leaning against the brick wall, one hand pressed against his side. "You shouldn't be out here," he had told me immediately, even though he was the one who looked like he needed help. His voice had been steady, controlled, like pain was something he simply ignored. I remember hesitating, staring at the dark stain spreading across his shirt, and realizing if I walked away, he might collapse right there on the wet pavement. "Sit down," I told him, already unlocking the pharmacy door again. "I'm not calling the police if that's what you're worried about." His eyes had narrowed slightly, studying me like he was measuring the risk. Then he stepped inside without another word. The smell of alcohol wipes and clean gauze filled the air as I worked. My hands trembled once when I saw how deep the cut was, but he never complained. Never even looked away. "Why help me?" he asked quietly while I stitched the wound closed under the bright overhead light. "Because you showed up at my door," I answered. That's usually reason enough. For a moment, something almost human crossed his expression. Not weakness. Something quieter than that. Gratitude, maybe. Then he stood up before dawn, buttoned his borrowed jacket, and headed for the door. "If anyone asks," he said, pausing under the dim light near the exit, "you never saw me." I thought that was the end of it. I thought by morning the blood would be cleaned off the floor and life would go back to normal. Instead, I stood barefoot on my porch staring at 200 men and a stranger walking toward me like the entire city moved when he did. Damian stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at me with the same steady eyes from the night before. His voice was softer than I expected when he finally spoke. "Claire Bennett," he said, "you saved my life." My throat went dry. The men behind him didn't move. The engines didn't stop humming. The whole street waited for whatever came next. Damian tilted his head slightly, studying my face like he was memorizing it. "Which means," he continued calmly, "everyone who wants me dead now knows exactly where you live." For a moment I could not breathe. The quiet street that had always smelled like fresh coffee from the corner bakery now felt colder, heavier, like the air itself had thickened around my house. I stared at Damien Cross at the bottom of my porch steps and tried to convince myself this was not real. 12 hours ago, he had been leaning against my pharmacy counter while rain ran down the windows. Now 200 men stood outside my home because of him. I folded my arms slowly, mostly so he would not see my hands shaking. You are telling me that helping you is the reason my street looks like a military parade? My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Damien watched me carefully. The same quiet focus from the night before had returned to his eyes. I am telling you that you did something very few people would do, he said. And now certain people may become curious about the woman who helped me. Curious. The word felt strangely calm for something that clearly terrified everyone else on the block. I glanced down the street again. Every man in a dark suit stood still, alert but not aggressive. No one spoke. No one looked impatient. They simply waited. My neighbor across the street slowly closed her curtain as if she had decided this was not her business anymore. I looked back at Damien. You could have sent a thank you card, I said quietly. A faint shadow of amusement passed across his face. Not quite a smile. Something close to it. This seemed more effective. I shook my head. You cannot just surround someone's house like this. I can, he answered simply. The honesty in that statement made my chest tighten. He was not bragging. He was stating a fact. The engines of the SUVs hummed softly in the background, like a quiet storm waiting to move. I stepped down one stair on the porch, trying to understand what kind of man I had brought into my life without realizing it. I helped a stranger, I said. I did not sign up for this. Damien nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. You did not sign up for it, he agreed. But circumstances do not always ask permission. He gestured lightly toward the street behind him. My men are here to make sure nothing happens to you. I let out a short breath of disbelief. Nothing has happened to me. Not yet. The way he said it made the quiet street feel colder again. I remembered the moment inside the pharmacy when he had asked why I helped him. At the time, I thought he was simply surprised. Now I wondered if he had already been calculating consequences. You are assuming I need protection, I said. Damien tilted his head slightly, studying me again like he had done the night before while I stitched the wound in his side. You do, he replied calmly. Because someone tried very hard to make sure I did not walk away last night. I felt the weight of those words settle in my stomach. I had not asked questions in the pharmacy. I had focused on cleaning the wound, closing the cut, and getting him out the door before sunrise. I had convinced myself it was none of my business. Now it sounded very much like my business. I stepped down another stair. The morning sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the buildings, casting long shadows across the parked SUVs. Let me understand something, I said. You show up with half the city outside my house to say thank you and warn me that I might be in danger because I helped you. That is correct. And your solution is to park 200 men outside my door. For the moment, he said. I rubbed my temples for a second. My normal morning routine involved unlocking the pharmacy and checking inventory, not negotiating with mysterious men who could shut down an entire street before breakfast. How long does this moment last? I asked. Damien looked up and down the block once, as if evaluating something invisible to me. When he answered, his voice was still calm, but slightly firmer. Until I am certain the people who are looking for me are not looking for you. The quiet certainty in his tone told me he meant every word. I looked past him at the silent line of men again. You realize the entire neighborhood is watching this. Yes. And you do not care. No. I studied his face, trying to find arrogance or cruelty or something easy to hate. Instead, I saw something stranger. Responsibility. Like he believed every consequence of last night belonged to him. Claire, he said quietly after a moment. Hearing my name again made me look back at him. You saved my life, he continued. I do not ignore debts like that. The street remained silent. The engines continued humming. I crossed my arms again and looked directly at him. Then here is my first condition, I said slowly. Damien's eyebrow lifted slightly. Condition? Yes, I replied. If you are going to turn my life upside down before 8 in the morning, you are at least going to explain what kind of trouble I just walked into. For the first time since he arrived, Damien Cross paused before answering. Damien Cross did not answer immediately. He looked at me the same way he had inside my pharmacy the night before, like every word mattered and silence sometimes mattered more. The street remained perfectly still behind him, 200 men waiting without a single impatient movement. Finally he spoke. You walked into a situation that was already moving before you ever saw me, he said calmly. Last night was simply the moment it crossed your path. I leaned against the porch railing, trying to process the idea that my quiet life had somehow collided with something much larger. That is not an explanation, I said. That is a warning. Damien gave a small nod, accepting the correction. Fair. He glanced briefly toward the corner of the street where two more black vehicles had just rolled into place, their engines idling quietly. There are people who do not like losing control of a situation, he continued. Last night someone tried to change mine. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was heavy. I remembered the deep cut in his side, the way he had kept standing even while I cleaned the wound. And now they are looking for you, I said slowly. Yes. Which means they might look for anyone who helped you. Exactly. I exhaled slowly through my nose. The logic was uncomfortable, but impossible to ignore. If someone had wanted Damien Cross gone, and he had disappeared instead of collapsing in my alley, questions would follow. Questions led to places. Places led to people. Like me. I looked past him again at the silent line of men. So this is what protection looks like to you. This is what prevention looks like to me, he replied. The calm certainty in his voice made it clear he had already considered every angle long before arriving here. I studied him more carefully now that the shock had faded slightly. Up close, he looked exactly as composed as he had under the pharmacy lights. Dark hair neatly combed. Clean white shirt. No sign of the injury I had stitched less than 12 hours earlier. My work had held. You should not be standing this straight yet, I said automatically. Damien blinked once, surprised by the comment. Doctor's instinct. Pharmacist, I corrected. And you should be resting. Something close to amusement flickered across his face again. Rest is relative. I crossed my arms. You showed up with half of New York City outside my house after sunrise. That does not sound like rest. He did not argue with that. Instead, he looked at the row of houses along the street. The brick buildings. The narrow sidewalks. The quiet neighborhood that normally woke slowly with dog walkers and delivery trucks. You have lived here long, he asked. The sudden change in topic caught me off guard. 3 years. You like it? It is quiet, I said. Usually. His eyes softened slightly as he studied the neighborhood again. I will make sure it returns to that. I raised an eyebrow. You say that like you can control the weather. Not the weather, he said calmly. Just the people who create storms. The statement hung in the morning air for a moment. I realized then that he truly believed what he was saying. Not in a dramatic way. In a practical one. Like someone used to solving problems others could not even see yet. I stepped down the final stair so that we stood only a few feet apart. The quiet hum of the engines filled the space between us. Let me ask you something, I said. If I had called the police last night instead of helping you, would we still be having this conversation? Damien met my eyes directly. No, because you would have disappeared before they arrived. Probably. Or because you would not trust me enough to stand on my porch this morning. He paused again, considering the question. When he answered, his voice was lower. Both. I nodded slowly. The honesty was unsettling, but oddly reassuring at the same time. At least he was not pretending to be something he was not. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the end of the street and then immediately turned around when the driver noticed the line of vehicles. The entire neighborhood had become a quiet island surrounded by black metal and watchful eyes. I sighed and rubbed my forehead. This is unbelievable. Damien glanced toward the street again and then back to me. It will not stay like this forever, he said. But for now I need to know something. I frowned slightly. What? His gaze sharpened just a little, the calm surface revealing the alert mind beneath it. Last night, he said quietly, when you were helping me, did you notice anyone else near the alley or the pharmacy? The question made my stomach tighten again. I searched my memory. The rain. The empty street. The flickering neon sign above the door. Then something faint stirred at the edge of my thoughts. A shadow across the wet pavement. The sound of a car door closing somewhere farther down the block. I slowly looked back at Damien. Why? I asked. His expression did not change, but the air around us felt suddenly heavier. Because if someone saw you helping me, he said calmly, then this situation just became much more complicated. I did not answer Damien immediately. The question hung between us while the quiet street watched in silence. My mind drifted back to the alley behind the pharmacy, replaying the night again piece by piece like a film I had only half paid attention to the first time. The rain had been steady, the kind that made the streetlights glow through a thin mist. My shoes had splashed through shallow puddles when I stepped outside with the flashlight. I had expected nothing more dramatic than a tipped trash bin. Instead, I found Damien leaning against the brick wall, one hand pressed to his side, his breathing controlled but strained. At the time, I had been focused on the obvious problem. Now I tried to remember everything else. There might have been a car, I said slowly. Damien did not interrupt. He waited with the patience of someone used to hearing information that arrived in pieces. I did not see it clearly, I continued, but I remember hearing a door close somewhere down the block. His eyes sharpened slightly. Before you found me, or after? Before, I said after a moment. I think it happened right before I stepped into the alley. The street behind him remained perfectly still, but I noticed several of the men had subtly shifted their attention toward Damien, listening without appearing to listen. Damien remained calm. Did you see the vehicle? No, only the sound. I paused again, searching deeper through the memory. The flicker of the pharmacy sign, the rain tapping against the metal trash lids, a brief reflection of headlights across the wet pavement. Maybe headlights, I added, just for a second, like someone turned a corner. Damien nodded slowly. His expression did not change, but I could feel the weight of the information settling somewhere behind those steady eyes. That helps, he said quietly. Helps how? I asked. It means someone may have realized I did not collapse where they expected. My stomach tightened again. You make it sound like they were waiting for that. Damien met my gaze calmly. They probably were. I exhaled slowly. My life had been simple 24 hours ago. Open the pharmacy at 8. Check the inventory. Fill prescriptions. Close the register. Now I was discussing mysterious cars and silent observers with a man who could summon 200 people before breakfast. I looked down the street again. A light breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves softly above the parked SUVs. The morning sun was climbing higher now, casting warm light across the brick buildings. The normal world continued moving somewhere beyond the edges of this moment. If someone saw me help you, I said carefully, what exactly happens next? Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the man who had first approached me on the sidewalk earlier. The man gave a small nod and stepped a few feet farther away, speaking quietly into a small device at his collar. I watched the silent coordination with growing disbelief. Every movement was smooth, controlled, practiced. When Damien looked back at me, his voice remained steady. It means the people who were watching last night might try to learn more about you. Learn more how? Observation, he said. Questions. Sometimes patience. The calm way he described it made the situation sound almost routine. I folded my arms again, trying to steady the strange mixture of fear and curiosity building in my chest. You talk about this like it is a business meeting. In some ways it is, he replied. Information is always valuable. I let out a quiet laugh that held no real humor. And apparently, I became valuable without realizing it. Damien studied me again, thoughtful now rather than analytical. You did something unexpected, he said. People who operate on plans do not always react well to surprises. I considered that. It made a strange kind of sense. If someone had arranged things to unfold a certain way, my decision to bring Damien into the pharmacy had changed that plan. I rubbed the back of my neck. So because I decided to be helpful, someone else's plan went wrong. Yes. And now they might want to know why. Yes. The simplicity of the answer made the situation feel even heavier. I stared at the quiet line of houses again, imagining unseen eyes somewhere beyond the corner of the block. You realize this is completely insane, I said. Damien's mouth curved very slightly again, not quite a smile, but close enough to show he understood the understatement. Your reaction is reasonable. I shook my head. That is comforting. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet morning wrapped around the street again. Somewhere a distant subway rumbled beneath the city. A dog barked faintly several blocks away. Life continued just out of reach of this strange standstill. Finally, Damien spoke again. Claire, he said quietly. I looked back at him. Until we know who might have been watching last night, it would be wise for you not to be alone. I gestured at the line of vehicles. You think I missed that message? This level of visibility is temporary, he said. But the concern is real. I studied him carefully. For the first time since he arrived, I noticed something new in his expression. Not authority, not calculation. Something closer to responsibility. like the entire situation had shifted onto his shoulders the moment I chose to help him. You feel responsible for this, I said slowly. Damien did not deny it. You showed me kindness when you had no reason to, he replied. That matters. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I looked past him again at the long line of men and vehicles that had turned my quiet street into a fortress. Then I looked back at the man whose presence had created the storm. All right, I said after a long moment. Then I guess we both need to figure out who might have been watching that alley. Damien nodded once. But before either of us could say another word, the man near the corner of the street suddenly straightened and spoke quickly into the device at his collar. Several of the men near the vehicles turned their heads in the same direction at the exact same moment. I felt the shift immediately, like the calm air had changed pressure. Damien's eyes moved toward the end of the block. What is it? I asked quietly. He did not answer right away. He watched the street for a long second before speaking. It seems, he said calmly, someone may already be curious. I followed Damien's gaze toward the end of the block, and for a moment I did not see anything unusual. The same quiet intersection, the same row of brick buildings catching the early morning light. But then I noticed a gray sedan parked half a block away that had not been there earlier. The car looked ordinary enough, the kind you would pass on any New York street without a second thought, but it was angled slightly toward my house instead of the curb. The engine was running. I could see the faint shimmer of exhaust drifting upward in the cool morning air. The man near the corner murmured something again into the device at his collar. Two of the suited men casually began walking down the sidewalk in that direction, their movements slow and controlled, like neighbors out for an early stroll. Damien remained perfectly still beside the bottom step of my porch. His posture did not change, but I could feel the focus in him shift. That car was not there 5 minutes ago, he said quietly. I squinted down the street again. You notice things like that automatically? Yes. I crossed my arms tighter across my chest. I wish I had that skill yesterday. Damien glanced at me briefly. Yesterday, you had a different priority. I knew what he meant. Yesterday, I had been focused on stopping the bleeding of a stranger in my pharmacy, not cataloging every vehicle on the block. Now the memory of that moment replayed again in my mind. The rain dripping from the edge of the awning. The cold tile floor inside the pharmacy. The smell of antiseptic and damp clothing. At the time, it had felt like a single quiet act of decency. Now it felt like the first domino in a chain reaction. Down the street, the two suited men reached the gray sedan. One of them leaned casually toward the driver's side window, as if asking for directions. The second man stood a few feet behind him, watching the intersection. From where I stood, I could not hear their voices, only see the subtle exchange of gestures. A moment later, the sedan slowly pulled away from the curb and turned the corner. The two men remained standing on the sidewalk for another second before turning back toward us. The tension in the air eased slightly. I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath. That was quick, I said. Damien's eyes followed the departing car until it disappeared around the corner. Observation rarely stays long once it is noticed, he replied. I tilted my head toward him. Observation. You keep using that word. Because it is accurate. I studied his expression carefully. Calm. Thoughtful, completely in control of himself even when the situation shifted. It was strange to realize how different he looked now compared to the man leaning against the alley wall the night before. The strength had always been there. I had simply been too focused on the injury to notice it. The two men returned to the line of vehicles. One of them gave Damien a brief nod. No alarm. No urgency. Just confirmation. Damien turned his attention back to me. It may have been nothing, he said. Or it may have been curiosity. You mean someone checking whether the story they heard was true? Possibly. I rubbed my forehead again, feeling the weight of the morning pressing down on my thoughts. This is unreal. Damien did not disagree. He looked up at the front of my house for the first time since arriving. The small porch. The chipped blue railing I kept meaning to repaint. The narrow flower box under the window that held more weeds than flowers this time of year. My normal life in every detail. You live alone here? He asked. Yes. No family nearby? No, I studied him suspiciously. Why? Because that changes how we approach the situation. I sighed. Of course it does. The breeze carried the faint smell of coffee from the bakery 2 blocks away. Somewhere down the street a door opened and quickly closed again when the owner noticed the line of vehicles. My neighborhood had become an accidental stage for something none of us understood. Damien, I said after a moment. He looked back at me. It still felt strange saying his name out loud. How long do you think this lasts? His gaze moved briefly across the street again before returning to me. Until I am certain that the people responsible for last night have lost interest in you. And if they do not lose interest? For the first time his expression grew slightly more serious. Not alarmed, just honest. Then we adapt. I let out a quiet laugh that sounded more tired than amused. You say that like it is simple. It is rarely simple, he said. But it is manageable. I looked down the street again, where the gray sedan had been moments earlier. The empty curb now looked completely ordinary again. Yet the feeling of being watched had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. I turned back to Damien slowly. You know what the strangest part of all this is? I said. What? I gestured toward the long line of vehicles and men standing calmly in the morning sun. 24 hours ago, I did not even know you existed. Damien studied my face quietly for a moment. Then he said something that made the weight of the morning shift in an entirely new direction. 24 hours ago, he replied calmly. I did not expect to owe my life to a pharmacist. For a moment, neither of us spoke after that. The quiet honesty in Damien's words lingered in the morning air, like something heavier than the line of black vehicles surrounding my block. I looked at him again, really looked this time, trying to understand the man standing at the base of my porch steps. Less than a day ago, he had been a stranger collapsing in a rainy alley. Now he stood here like the calm center of a storm I had accidentally stepped into. You keep saying you owe me, I said slowly. But I did not help you expecting anything in return. Damien nodded once, as if he already knew that. That is exactly why the debt matters, he replied. I leaned against the porch railing again, studying the street. The 200 men had not moved much, but the energy around them felt different now. Not tense exactly, just alert. Like a group of people used to waiting for situations to evolve. You know, I said after a moment, most people would have just sent flowers. A faint hint of amusement touched his expression again. Flowers would not solve the problem. And this does. I gestured at the long row of vehicles. This buys time, he said. I watched one of the men farther down the street quietly direct a delivery truck away from the block with a polite wave and a calm smile. No arguments. No raised voices. Just quiet control. It was unsettling how smoothly everything functioned around Damien. Time for what? I asked. Time to understand who might be asking questions, he answered. I sighed and rubbed my hands together against the cool morning air. The sun had climbed higher now, casting warm light across the rooftops, but my street still felt like a stage set for someone else's story. You keep saying someone might be curious about me, I said. But what exactly do they think I know? Damien looked toward the end of the block again before answering. Right now they do not know what you know. Which is nothing, I said quickly. I patched a wound and told you not to reopen it. That is the full extent of my involvement. You are certain? He asked calmly. I frowned. What is that supposed to mean? When people remember events after the fact, sometimes details appear later. I thought about that for a second. The rain, the alley, the faint sound of a car door, the brief flash of headlights. I already told you everything I remember, I said. And that is helpful, he replied. His tone made it clear he believed me. Still, the idea that someone might be watching because of that small moment made the back of my neck feel cold. I looked past him again toward the quiet street corner. Everything appeared normal again. Too normal. If someone really was watching last night, I said slowly, why would they wait until this morning to check? Damien's answer came without hesitation. Because patience is safer than rushing. I studied him for a long second. You have a very specific way of understanding the world. Experience helps. That sounds like a polite way of saying you deal with this kind of thing often. Damien did not deny it. Instead, he glanced briefly at the man standing near the first SUV, who seemed to be quietly monitoring the entire street. My world is not usually this visible, he said. You mean you do not normally park 200 people outside someone's house? Correct. I let out a small breath of disbelief. That is good to know. The breeze shifted slightly, carrying the distant sound of traffic from the avenue several blocks away. The city was waking up beyond our little island of silence. I realized suddenly that I had not even opened the pharmacy yet. The clock on the wall inside my house would be approaching 8:30. Normally by now I would already be behind the counter organizing prescription orders. Instead, I was standing on my porch talking about unseen observers and borrowed time. Damien, I said after a moment. He looked back at me immediately. Yes, I still have a business to open today. For the first time, he seemed genuinely surprised. You intend to go to work? Of course I do, I replied. People need their medication whether mysterious strangers show up in alleys or not. The corner of his mouth moved again, that almost smile returning. You are remarkably calm about this situation. I shrugged slightly. I am not calm. I am practical. I gestured toward the street. And I cannot exactly hide inside my house, while half your security team redecorates my neighborhood. Damien considered that for a moment. His eyes moved toward the line of vehicles, then back to me. You may go about your routine, he said finally. But not alone. I stared at him. You are suggesting I walk into my pharmacy followed by a small parade of bodyguards. I am suggesting that until we know more, caution is wise. I shook my head slowly, trying to picture my quiet shop filled with suited men standing between the cough syrup and the vitamin aisle. My customers are going to think I joined a secret government agency. Damien's expression softened slightly. They will think you have friends who take your safety seriously. I studied him again, trying to decide whether he was joking. It was impossible to tell. Finally, I sighed. You know what the strangest part of all this is? I said. Yesterday, I thought helping you was the complicated part. Damien looked up at the quiet morning sky for a moment before answering. Yesterday was only the beginning. I stared at Damien for a long second after he said that, trying to decide whether my life had quietly stepped into something temporary or something that would not disappear so easily. The morning sun had climbed higher now, lighting the tops of the parked SUVs like a row of polished mirrors. My street looked less like a neighborhood and more like a carefully arranged perimeter. I exhaled slowly. All right, I said. If I am going to work, then I should probably start getting ready. Damien nodded slightly, as if that had already been part of his plan. You may go inside, he said. My men will remain here. I turned toward the front door of my house, then paused with my hand on the knob. You realize the entire neighborhood is going to remember this day forever. Possibly, Damien replied calmly behind me. I glanced back over my shoulder. And you are completely fine with that. Reputation is rarely the biggest concern in situations like this. I studied him for a second, then opened the door and stepped inside. The quiet of my house felt strange after standing outside in the middle of 200 silent witnesses. The familiar smell of coffee from the kitchen and the faint ticking of the wall clock felt almost surreal. For a moment, I leaned against the closed door and let the stillness settle around me. Yesterday morning had been simple. Wake up, make coffee, open the pharmacy. Now I had an unexpected security detail parked on my block because I decided to help a wounded stranger. I walked to the kitchen window and pulled the curtain aside slightly. Damien had not moved. He still stood at the bottom of the porch steps, speaking quietly with the man who had first approached me earlier. Even from inside the house, I could feel the calm gravity of his presence. It was the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without him ever raising his voice. I let the curtain fall back into place and moved upstairs to get ready. 10 minutes later, I stepped out of the house again, wearing my usual work clothes and carrying the small canvas bag that held my pharmacy keys and paperwork. The moment I opened the door, several of the suited men subtly straightened. Not aggressively, just aware. Damien turned toward me immediately. His eyes moved quickly across my posture, as if confirming I was exactly the same person who had gone inside moments earlier. You work quickly, he said. Opening a pharmacy requires punctuality, I replied. I stepped down the porch stairs and stopped beside him. Up close, I noticed again how steady he looked, as if the injury from the night before had never existed. How is the wound? I asked quietly. He seemed slightly surprised by the question. It is healing, he said. Your work was precise. Good, I said. Because if you reopen it today, I am not fixing it again. A small trace of amusement touched his expression. Understood. I glanced down the street where the vehicles were still parked in a calm, silent formation. So how exactly does this work? I asked. Damien gestured lightly toward one of the black SUVs. You will ride with us to the pharmacy. I stared at him. You want me to arrive at my shop like a visiting diplomat? You will arrive safely, he corrected. I rubbed my forehead. My regular customers are retirees and parents picking up cold medicine. This is going to be the strangest morning they have ever had. They will adjust, he said calmly. I let out a breath and started walking toward the SUV he had indicated. The men near the vehicle opened the door smoothly without a word. I paused before getting in and looked back at Damien. You are coming too? Yes. You trust your men, but not the situation. That is accurate. I climbed into the back seat and waited while Damien stepped in beside me. The door closed with a quiet, solid sound. Outside, several of the other SUVs began to move in slow coordination, forming a loose line along the street. I looked through the tinted window. As my small neighborhood slid slowly past, Mrs. Delgado was still peeking through her curtain across the street. Her expression shifted from confusion to outright shock as the convoy began rolling forward. I am going to be the main topic of conversation on this block for the next 10 years, I said quietly. Damien looked out the window calmly. Perhaps, he said. The SUV turned onto the main road and merged into the morning traffic of New York City. For a moment, the city felt normal again. Yellow taxis, people rushing toward subway entrances, delivery trucks double parked along the curb. Then I noticed the reflection of the other black vehicles moving behind us in the glass storefronts we passed. I folded my arms and looked at Damien again. You realize something, right? He glanced toward me. What? I watched the city slide past outside the window, and then said the thought that had been building in my mind since the moment he arrived at my house. Yesterday, I helped a stranger because it felt like the right thing to do. Damien remained quiet, listening. I continued. Today, that stranger just escorted me to work with half a security team. I paused and met his calm eyes directly. And I still do not know exactly who you are. I held Damien's gaze after my question, the quiet hum of the SUV engine filling the space between us while Manhattan morning traffic moved around our convoy like water flowing around a stone. For a moment, he did not answer. He simply watched the street through the tinted window as pedestrians hurried past coffee shops and subway entrances, unaware that several black vehicles were moving through the city in perfect formation around one small pharmacy owner who had made a very questionable life decision 12 hours earlier. Finally, he looked back at me. That is a fair question, he said calmly. I was beginning to think you preferred mystery. I crossed my arms. I prefer information. A faint trace of humor passed across his face again. That quiet, almost smile he seemed to use when something genuinely amused him. My name, he said, as you already know, is Damien Cross. That part one figured out, I replied. The rest is still very unclear. He considered that for a second. Outside the window, a taxi honked impatiently as our convoy slowed for a red light. The other black SUVs adjusted smoothly, maintaining their quiet formation around us without blocking traffic or drawing too much attention. It was impressive in a strange, unsettling way. Damien finally spoke again. I run several companies, he said. Investment groups, transportation firms, and a few logistics networks that operate across multiple states. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds very official. It is. But it also sounds incomplete. His eyes shifted toward me with a look that suggested he appreciated direct questions. You are observant. Occupational habit, I said. Pharmacists notice details. He nodded slightly. Some of my business operations require discretion. I studied him for a moment, letting the meaning settle into place. Discretion, I repeated. That is a polite word. It usually is. The SUV turned onto the avenue where my pharmacy sat halfway down the block between a laundromat and a small grocery store. I watched the familiar storefronts approaching through the tinted window. My shop sign hung above the door exactly where it always had. The bright green lettering looked strangely ordinary compared to everything that had happened this morning. You know, I said quietly, most people who run investment companies do not wake up surrounded by 200 security guards. Damien looked out the window at the pharmacy sign as the SUV slowed to the curb. My work sometimes attracts attention. Clearly, the vehicle stopped smoothly. One of the men outside stepped forward and opened the door for us. The city noise returned immediately as the door swung open. Car horns. A bus braking at the corner. The low rumble of morning traffic filling the air. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked up at the front of my pharmacy. The windows reflected the line of black SUVs that had quietly parked along the block. My normal workday had officially become something very different. Damien stepped out beside me, adjusting his jacket slightly as if this were the most ordinary stop in the world. Several of the suited men moved subtly into position along the sidewalk and near the entrances of nearby buildings. They did not block anyone. They simply existed there, calm and watchful. I stared at the scene and shook my head slowly. My customers are going to think I started working for the Secret Service. Damien glanced toward the storefront and then back at me. Your routine remains the same, he said. We are simply ensuring it continues safely. I walked toward the pharmacy door and unlocked it, feeling his presence a few steps behind me. The familiar bell above the entrance chimed softly when I pushed the door open. The smell of clean floors and medicine shelves greeted me like a piece of normal life that had somehow survived the morning chaos. I stepped behind the counter and set my bag down. Damien remained near the front window, watching the street outside for a moment before turning his attention toward the rows of neatly organized shelves. You built this business yourself, he said. It was not a question. Yes. It shows. I glanced at him while switching on the overhead lights. That is probably the most normal sentence anyone has said to me all morning. The fluorescent lights hummed softly as the shop brightened. Through the front window, I could see two of the suited men standing near the curb, while another leaned casually against a parked car pretending to check his phone. None of them looked out of place unless you knew what to look for. I turned back to Damien. So let me see if I understand your explanation, I said. You run several companies that require discretion. Someone tried to interfere with your plans last night, and now I am involved because I helped you stay on your feet long enough to leave that alley. That is accurate, he replied calmly. I rested my hands on the pharmacy counter and looked directly at him. And you still have not told me the one detail that would actually explain everything. Damien watched me carefully. Which detail? I held his gaze. The kind of business that makes 200 men appear outside my house before sunrise. For the first time since we had met, Damien Cross paused longer than usual before answering. Damien did not answer right away. The silence stretched across the pharmacy like a thin thread pulled tight between 2 points. Outside the large front window, the morning traffic continued to move through the avenue, completely unaware that the quiet man standing beside the vitamin aisle had just been asked a question that most people would never dare to ask him directly. I watched him carefully. He did not look uncomfortable. He simply looked thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. The kind of business, he said calmly, that requires loyalty. I folded my arms across the counter. That is still not very specific. His eyes moved across the rows of neatly organized shelves behind me, the bottles of medicine lined up in perfect order. Specific answers can change how people see the world around them, he said. Sometimes it is better to understand the situation before attaching labels. I shook my head slowly. You arrived at my house with 200 men before sunrise. I gestured toward the street outside the window. I think labels are already part of the situation. A quiet breath of amusement escaped him. Not laughter, just acknowledgement. Fair point. He walked slowly along the front window and looked out at the sidewalk where two of his men stood near the curb, blending almost perfectly into the normal rhythm of the city. A delivery cyclist passed them without even glancing twice. Damien turned back toward me. You have heard stories about people who operate in the shadows of the business world, he said. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds like the beginning of a documentary. Some of those stories are exaggerated, he continued calmly. Some are not. I studied his face carefully, letting the meaning settle in piece by piece. The quiet control, the coordinated convoy, the effortless way 200 people appeared when he needed them. A realization slowly formed in my mind. You are not just running investment companies, I said. Damien met my eyes without hesitation. No. The simple honesty of that answer carried more weight than a long explanation would have. I exhaled slowly and leaned against the counter behind me. You know what the strange part is? I said after a moment. What? I am not actually surprised. His expression shifted slightly. Curious now. Why not? I glanced around the pharmacy. The clean tile floor. The quiet hum of the refrigeration unit behind the counter. The calm order of my everyday life. Then I looked back at him. Because last night when you walked into my shop, I said, you did not look like someone who expected help. Damien's gaze remained steady. And that told you something. Yes. I remembered the way he had watched every movement I made while I cleaned the wound. The way his eyes had scanned the room automatically, as if measuring exits and angles without even thinking about it. You looked like someone who had learned not to rely on strangers, I said. The corner of his mouth moved again, that faint, almost smile returning. That is a reasonable observation. I let out a quiet breath and shook my head once more. So let me try to say this in plain English. I continued. You operate in a world where loyalty matters more than paperwork, where problems are solved quietly, and where people are willing to show up in large numbers if someone threatens your plans. Damien watched me carefully, but did not interrupt. I finished the thought. Which means you are not just a businessman. The silence inside the pharmacy deepened slightly. Outside, a woman pushing a stroller past the storefront window without noticing the subtle line of security watching the street. Damien finally spoke again. No, he said calmly. I am not. I rubbed my temple with 2 fingers, feeling the weight of the morning finally settle fully into place. That is what I thought. He tilted his head slightly. You seem remarkably composed about the revelation. I laughed quietly under my breath. That is because I figured it out about 30 seconds ago. And you are not frightened? He asked. I considered the question honestly. My life had already changed the moment I opened the pharmacy door last night and saw him leaning against the alley wall. Fear would not rewind that decision. No, I said finally. I am mostly irritated. Damien's eyebrow lifted slightly. Irritated? Yes, I said, gesturing toward the window again. Because now I understand why 200 men are outside my building and why someone might be curious about the pharmacist who helped you. I paused and met his eyes again. Which means I accidentally stepped into the middle of your world. Damien did not argue with that. Instead, he said something that made the quiet room feel suddenly much smaller. No, he replied calmly. You stepped into it the moment you decided not to walk away from that alley. I stood behind the pharmacy counter for a moment after Damien said that, letting the weight of his words settle into the quiet room. The hum of the refrigerator unit filled the silence while sunlight filtered through the front window and reflected softly across the glass medicine shelves. Yesterday, I had stepped into an alley because someone might need help. Today, I was standing inside my own pharmacy, realizing that single decision had quietly placed me in the path of something much larger than I had imagined. I let out a slow breath and rested my palms against the counter. You know, I said, most people who walk into an alley and find a wounded stranger do not expect to wake up inside a completely different reality the next morning. Damien watched me calmly from near the front window. Life rarely announces when it is about to change direction, he said. I glanced at him. You sound like someone who has experienced that more than once. His gaze moved briefly toward the street outside before returning to me. More than once, he admitted. I shook my head slowly and reached for the register drawer to begin setting up the morning shift. Routine helped clear my thoughts. Inventory sheets, prescription trays, label printer. These were things I understood. These were things that made sense. Behind me, the doorbell above the entrance chimed softly as the first customer of the day pushed the door open. An older man in a gray jacket stepped inside, pausing slightly when he noticed Damien standing near the window. Then he looked at me behind the counter and smiled in the familiar way regular customers do. Morning, Claire, he said. Morning, Mr. Carter. I replied automatically. The normal exchange felt almost surreal after everything that had happened. Mr. Carter walked toward the counter and placed a prescription slip down. Doctor says I need to start taking this new medication, he explained. Apparently turning 70 comes with paperwork. I smiled faintly and picked up the slip. That sounds accurate. I moved toward the shelves behind me to fill the order while Mr. Carter glanced curiously around the shop. His eyes drifted toward Damien again, then toward the window where 2 men in dark suits stood near the curb outside. Busy morning out there, he commented casually. City never really slows down, I replied. Damien remained silent near the window, hands resting calmly at his sides, blending into the scene like he had always belonged inside a small neighborhood pharmacy. Mr. Carter accepted the explanation without pressing further. A few minutes later, he left with his medication and a cheerful wave, apparently deciding the unusual activity outside was not something he needed to worry about. The doorbell chimed again as he stepped out. I watched the door close and then looked back at Damien. See, I said quietly. Normal life continues. Damien nodded once. That is the goal. I placed the prescription bottle into the pickup bin and leaned against the counter again. But let us be honest, I added. Normal life usually does not involve security teams outside the vitamin aisle. His expression softened slightly. Temporary circumstances. I raised an eyebrow. You are very confident about that. Confidence is useful, he replied. I studied him for a moment, then glanced out the window again. The suited men outside had shifted slightly to allow pedestrians to pass comfortably along the sidewalk. They looked less like guards and more like quiet observers now, though the awareness in their posture never disappeared. Earlier you said someone might still be curious about me, I said slowly. Damien's eyes sharpened slightly. Yes. And that curiosity is because I helped you leave that alley. Correct. I folded my arms again and leaned forward slightly. Then let me ask a more practical question. Go ahead. What happens if that curiosity turns into something more direct? The room grew slightly quieter after I said that. Damien did not look alarmed. He simply considered the question with the calm focus I had already come to recognize. Finally he answered. Then we address it. I gave a quiet laugh. You make that sound very simple. Simple does not always mean easy, he said. I looked at him carefully, realizing something else that had been building in the back of my mind since the moment he arrived at my house. You said earlier that you owed me, I said. Yes. Not because of business. Not because of strategy. Because I helped you when I did not have to. His eyes met mine steadily. That is correct. I nodded once and tapped my fingers lightly on the counter. Then here is the part one still do not understand. Damien waited. I held his gaze and spoke the thought that had been quietly forming since the morning began. If your world is as complicated as it seems, I said, why would someone like you trust someone like me to stay calm in the middle of it? Damien cross-watched me for a long moment before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but completely certain. Because last night, he said, you had every reason to walk away from that alley. I waited. He finished the thought. And you did not. I did not respond immediately after Damien said that. The quiet certainty in his voice lingered in the pharmacy like the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above us. Outside the front window, the city continued moving through its usual morning rhythm. People walked past with coffee cups in their hands. A taxi slowed near the corner. A bus hissed to a stop 2 blocks away. The world outside looked completely ordinary, yet the reality inside my small pharmacy felt like something entirely different had quietly taken root. I folded my arms across the counter and studied him for a moment. So your entire trust in me is based on the fact that I did not walk away from a stranger in an alley, I said. Damien remained calm, leaning slightly against the wall near the window as he watched the sidewalk outside. It tells me something important about your character, he replied. I shook my head slightly. It tells you I have poor survival instincts. The faint trace of amusement returned to his expression again. It tells me you make decisions based on principle rather than fear. I considered that. It sounded flattering, but it also sounded like the kind of logic that could pull someone deeper into a complicated situation without realizing it. Before I could respond, the doorbell above the pharmacy entrance chimed again. A young mother walked in with a small boy holding her hand. The child immediately noticed the colorful display of vitamins, shaped like cartoon animals, and pointed toward the shelf with great enthusiasm. The woman smiled apologetically as she approached the counter. Morning, she said. Do you have the children's cold syrup that is sugar-free? Of course, I replied automatically, stepping away from the conversation and retrieving the bottle from the shelf behind me. The small interruption grounded me again. This was my world. Prescriptions. Questions about medicine. Children reaching for bright labels. While I rang up the purchase, I noticed the woman glance briefly toward Damien, standing near the front window. He had not moved. He simply stood there calmly, looking like someone who belonged in a quiet shop on an ordinary morning. The woman accepted the receipt, thanked me, and guided her son back toward the door. The bell chimed again as they left. For a moment the shop was quiet once more. I leaned against the counter again and looked at Damien. You blend in surprisingly well for someone who arrived with an entire convoy, I said. Adaptation is useful, he replied. I nodded slowly and glanced toward the window again. The men outside remained positioned along the sidewalk, speaking quietly among themselves while keeping their attention on the street. Anyone passing by might assume they were simply co-workers waiting for a ride or employees from nearby offices starting their day early. Only someone paying close attention would notice how carefully they watched everything. I turned back toward Damien. You know something else that bothers me about this situation? I said. What is that? You are calm about everything, I said. Someone tried to interfere with your plans last night. You ended up in an alley with a serious injury. And this morning you are standing in a pharmacy discussing character traits. Damien listened without interrupting. I continued. Most people would be angry, or worried, or at least slightly unsettled. And you think I am none of those things, he said. You do not look like it. He was quiet for a moment after that. His eyes moved across the shelves, the neat rows of bottles and labels reflecting the overhead lights. Finally, he spoke. Appearances can be misleading, he said quietly. I studied him carefully. For the first time since he had arrived at my house, I noticed a subtle tension beneath the calm surface. Not panic, not fear, something closer to controlled focus, like a chess player watching the board several moves ahead. So you are concerned? I said. Concern encourages preparation, he replied. I nodded slowly. That made sense. Everything about Damien suggested someone who prepared for problems before they fully appeared. I glanced at the clock above the register. The morning had barely begun, yet it already felt like several days had passed since I stepped outside my house and saw 200 men waiting on the street. Tell me something honestly, I said. Damien looked back at me. Of course. In your world, I continued, when someone interferes with your plans the way you described last night, does the situation usually end quickly? The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it felt longer. Damien did not avoid the question. Sometimes, he said. And sometimes, I asked. He looked out the front window again toward the street, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes the situation unfolds slowly. I followed his gaze through the glass. The street looked exactly the same as it had a few minutes earlier. People walking, traffic moving, nothing unusual at all. Yet something about the way Damien watched the road made the quiet air inside the pharmacy feel slightly heavier again. Slowly, I repeated, meaning there may still be people watching. Damien nodded once. I leaned against the counter and exhaled softly. Well, I said, that explains the convoy. He glanced back toward me. You regret helping me? I thought about that question carefully. 12 hours ago, the answer would have been obvious. Now it was more complicated. Finally, I shook my head. No, I said, but I am beginning to understand something. What is that? Damien asked. I met his eyes steadily across the pharmacy counter. When someone steps into your world, I said quietly, they probably do not step back out of it easily. I watched Damien carefully after I said that, expecting him to disagree or offer some calm explanation that would make the situation feel smaller. Instead, he remained quiet for a moment, his attention drifting briefly toward the front window again, where the slow movement of the city continued outside. The silence told me enough before he even spoke. No, he said finally. They usually do not. I let out a slow breath and leaned back against the counter, absorbing the honesty of the answer. It was not dramatic. It was not threatening. It was simply factual, and somehow that made it more real than anything else he had said that morning. The bell above the door chimed again as another customer entered the pharmacy, a middle-aged man in a construction jacket who nodded politely when he saw me behind the counter. Morning, he said. Morning, I replied automatically. He moved toward the pain relief aisle while I began organizing the prescription trays again, trying to let routine keep my thoughts steady. Damien stepped slightly farther from the window so that customers would not feel watched, yet he still kept the street in his peripheral vision. It was subtle, but I was starting to notice how naturally he positioned himself in every space. The construction worker picked up a bottle of ibuprofen and approached the counter. Busy outside today, he said, casually while placing the bottle down. I followed his glance toward the window where one of Damien's men stood near the curb pretending to check something on his phone. City traffic, I said. He shrugged and paid for the medicine without asking more questions. A minute later, he was gone again, the bell chiming softly as the door closed behind him. The quiet returned to the pharmacy. I looked over at Damien again. You see what I mean? I said quietly. People assume everything is normal. That is usually preferable, he replied. I nodded slowly and glanced down at the counter. The clean surface reflected the overhead lights in long white lines. My life had been defined by simple things like that reflection. Order, routine, predictability. Now the edges of that order felt slightly different. Not broken, just expanded into something I had never expected to experience. You know something interesting, I said after a moment. Damien looked at me. What? Yesterday, if someone had told me that I would be having this conversation with someone like you, I would have assumed they were joking. His expression softened slightly. And now I am standing in my own pharmacy while the man I helped in an alley explains why my life might be under observation. I gestured lightly toward the window. That is a very specific kind of morning. The faintest trace of a smile appeared again. Life has unusual timing. I leaned against the counter and studied him carefully. You keep saying that, I said, but I am beginning to suspect that your world is built on unusual timing. He did not deny it. Instead, he glanced toward the street again. Outside, two of his men had shifted positions slightly as a delivery truck slowed near the curb before continuing down the block. The movement was smooth and coordinated, like quiet choreography. I followed his gaze for a moment before looking back at him. Tell me something honestly, I said. Of course. Last night, I continued. When you realized I was going to help you, did you expect to see me again? Damien thought about that question longer than usual. Finally, he shook his head once. No, he admitted. Then why come to my house this morning instead of simply disappearing again? His answer came without hesitation. Because leaving the situation unresolved would create more risk for you. I stared at him. You could have just sent someone else to warn me. Yes, but you did not. No, the quiet certainty in that exchange lingered between us. I realized something then that I had not fully acknowledged before. Damien had not just sent protection. He had shown up himself. That detail changed the shape of the morning in a way I had not noticed until now. You came personally, I said slowly. Yes. That seems unusual for someone in your position. His expression grew slightly more thoughtful again. It was necessary. I studied him carefully. Necessary for my safety, or for your peace of mind? For the first time, he did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced once more toward the window, and then back at me. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Both, he said. The honesty of that answer made the small pharmacy feel even more still. Outside, the traffic continued flowing past the block like nothing in the world had changed. But inside the shop, I realized something important had quietly shifted between the moment I opened my door that morning and now. I straightened slightly behind the counter and looked directly at him. Then I guess we both need to accept something, I said. What is that? Damien asked. I held his gaze steadily. Yesterday I saved your life, I said. And today it looks like you are determined to protect mine. I held his gaze after saying that, letting the quiet truth of the moment settle between us. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The pharmacy lights hummed softly above our heads while the city continued its usual rhythm outside the glass storefront. Cars rolled past the intersection. A cyclist slowed near the curb. Somewhere down the block, a bus released a long sigh of air as passengers stepped onto the sidewalk. Everything looked ordinary. Yet standing there across from Damien Cross, I knew the definition of ordinary had quietly shifted for both of us. Damien finally nodded once. That is an accurate way to describe it, he said calmly. I leaned my hands against the counter and studied him carefully. You say it like this arrangement is temporary. His expression remained steady. Every situation evolves. That is not exactly reassuring, I replied. The faint trace of a smile returned to the corner of his mouth, though his eyes remained thoughtful. Reassurance is rarely honest in situations like this. I exhaled slowly and glanced toward the window again. Outside, two of his men had repositioned themselves slightly as the morning crowd thickened along the sidewalk. People passed by with coffee cups and backpacks, never realizing that the quiet formation along the curb existed because of something that happened in a narrow alley 12 hours earlier. I turned back toward Damien. Let me ask you something else, I said. Go ahead. If last night had gone differently, if I had closed my door and pretended I never saw you, what would have happened? Damien considered the question for a moment before answering. I would have found another way to leave the area, he said. You are certain? Yes. I studied him for another second. But it would have been more difficult. Probably. I nodded slowly. That answer confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Helping him had not just changed my situation. It had changed his as well. The bell above the pharmacy door chimed again as a college student stepped inside, looking for cough drops. I rang up the purchase quickly while Damien moved slightly aside so the young man would not feel watched. When the customer left, the quiet returned again. I leaned against the counter and folded my arms. You know what is strange about this entire morning, I said. Damien glanced toward me. What is that? Nothing about you feels reckless, I said. Yet your entire life seems to operate on the edge of situations most people avoid. His gaze shifted briefly toward the rows of medicine bottles behind me before returning to my face. Some environments require different forms of discipline, he replied. I tilted my head slightly. That is a very controlled way of describing it. Control is useful. I could not help but smile faintly at that. I am beginning to notice. The sunlight through the front window had grown brighter now, filling the shop with a warm glow that reflected off the glass shelves. For a moment, the pharmacy looked exactly the way it always had on any other weekday morning. The difference was the quiet understanding standing between Damien and me. I rested my elbows on the counter. So what happens now? I asked. Now? Yes, I said. Your men watch the street. I fill prescriptions. The city keeps moving. How long does this version of reality last? Damien looked out the window again, studying the street with the careful awareness that seemed second nature to him. When he answered, his voice remained calm. Until the people responsible for last night understand that you are no longer an easy question to ask. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a warning. It is a deterrent. I considered that phrasing. Meaning your presence here sends a message. Exactly. I glanced toward the sidewalk where the quiet line of suited men continued their silent observation of the block. And the message is that the pharmacist who helped you is under your protection. Damien met my eyes again. Yes. I let out a slow breath. The idea should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt strangely clear. A simple cause and effect. I helped a man who needed help. Now that man had decided my safety mattered to him. I straightened slightly behind the counter and looked directly at him. Then I suppose there is one thing I should say. Damien waited. I met his steady gaze without hesitation. Next time you find yourself injured in an alley, I said calmly, you should probably choose a safer neighborhood. For the first time since we had met, Damien Cross actually laughed softly under his breath. It was brief and quiet, but genuine. Noted, he replied. I picked up the next prescription bottle and began labeling it while the soft hum of the pharmacy filled the room again. Outside, the city moved forward as it always did, unaware that somewhere between a rainy alley and a quiet storefront, two completely different worlds had quietly crossed paths. And deep down, I had the strange feeling that this morning was only the beginning of whatever came next.